Well, hello and welcome to this session on hydrocarbons in a net zero future, carbon capture and other approaches, a part of the Economist Sustainability Week Countdown to COP26 series of events. My name is Alex Zapantis and I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, a not-for-profit think tank with a mission of accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage for climate mitigation purposes. I'm joined by three very eminent panellists with several decades of collective experience and deep expertise in the topics we're about to discuss. These panellists are Ahmad Al Khowaiter, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Saudi Aramco, a leading producer of energy and chemicals and one of the largest companies in the world by revenue. Ahmad joined Saudi Aramco in 1983, where he held various technical roles in oil and gas production organisations, ranging from design, project management, commissioning and operations, as well as a number of general management positions. Our second panellist is Samantha McCulloch, who is the head of the CCUS unit at the Paris-based International Energy Agency. Her team provides leading analysis and insights on the development and deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage technologies. Samantha is a lead author of several International Energy Agency publications, including the Energy Technology Perspectives Special Report on CCUS and clean energy transitions. And our third panellist is Adam Sieminski, who is currently a senior advisor to the board and previous president of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Centre, also known as KAPSARC. KAPSARC is an independent, non-profit research think tank located in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Its mission is to advance the understanding of energy, economics, and the environment. So just a reminder to our panellists, our aim is to have a free-flowing and lively conversation, so please speak up. No need to wait to be asked to speak. Okay, so let's get straight to it. I'd like to kick off the conversation with a question for Adam, and then I'd like to hear any additional comments from Ahmad and Samantha, and we can take the conversation from there. So Adam, since the utilisation of fossil fuels is the dominant cause of greenhouse gas emissions, shouldn't we just quit fossil fuels?
Well, that's there are some people that are calling for that, Alex. Just ban all hydrocarbons. I think there's a couple of flaws with that idea. And let me just highlight. The first one is it really seems to concentrate on the supply side. As okay, we'll just get rid of the supply without thinking through the implications for demand. How do you actually do that if consumers, and that could be individuals, it could be businesses, continue to require hydrocarbons to meet their needs? The second category of issues that I see in terms of that kind of response comes in three parts. The first part is there are some really hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation, heavy-duty trucking, marine transportation, cement manufacturing, and metal smelting, just for starters. The second part of that is there are a lot of people in the world that still don't have energy. 1 billion people without electricity, more than 1 billion people that don't have clean cooking fuels. And that's really hard on women and children. We need to find a way to deal with that, and that's not going to be easy if you just simply say no more hydrocarbons. And then the third aspect is one of infrastructure. The cost of prematurely abandoning the infrastructure that's been built up over 100 years to deliver very valuable products to consumers, it could be extremely costly, and we wouldn't want that kind of a rapid impact to dissuade us from actually dealing with the problem. We all know that temperatures are going up, and we've got to deal effectively with managing emissions, and we don't want to poison that very good idea with poorly thought out answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Any other comments on that first question from other panelists before I move on?
Oh, if I can jump in on this, I think it's really important on the question of fossil fuels to recognise that today around 80% of the energy mix is actually supplied by fossil fuels, and this is a figure that has been virtually unchanged now for 3 or more decades, and even in very, very ambitious climate pathways. So here I'm referring to the IEA's NetZero Roadmap. There is even still a role for fossil fuels in these very ambitious climate pathways. So we still have around 20% of energy use coming from fossil fuels by 2050 in a net zero world. And so while there's, of course, no question that we need to really dramatically and immediately start reducing our reliance on fossil fuels if we want to meet these ambitious climate targets, I think we need to recognise the current energy mix. As Adam said, much of the current infrastructure that we have is built around fossil fuels. Much of the existing assets, whether that's power-based or industrial assets, are located in emerging economies that are grappling with energy security, economic development, energy access challenges. And so we need to be pragmatic in terms of what the role will be moving forward.
Ahmad, would you like to share a view?
Yeah, I think I would focus on the economics, since both of the topics are covered very well in infrastructure and the hard to decarbonize sectors. The fact is, the alternatives are not that cheap, and they're not available in all of the options. In fact, the majority of the options, and the majority of the energy mix. So, renewables are a great solution and a great option, and actually very competitive, but not across the entire demand that's needed. And so even the 18% of the primary energy mix, which goes to electricity, only 30% of that is actually economically competitive because of the lack of storage. So even if we wanted just to decarbonize the electricity sector alone, the 18% with renewables only and not some fossil fuel support, you would end up with a very expensive mix. And then if you go beyond the 18%, which is electricity, the 82% of the primary energy mix, which goes to heat industry, chemicals, and just so many other uses, we don't have technical solutions ready. We have some initial solutions like batteries and transport, light duty transport, but the bulk of the light duty represents maybe 50% of transport. That's still a small part of that 80% that I'm talking about. So I think the economics are going to drive, and we're seeing that recently. I know people don't want to blame ESG policy, but in fact, these are very, very difficult markets when it comes to pricing and supply and demand.
Okay, so I've just heard that fossil energy is very much the basis upon which our economies are run at the moment, with about 80% of share, and it's going to be very difficult to move away from fossil fuels. Yet we have the IEA report that was published last year, it's Net Zero by 2050 report, which described a pathway which involves, in its own words, a huge decline in the use of fossil fuels. Now, for example, that report says no new oil and gas field development starting now. It assumes a reduction in global energy demand of 8% by 2050 compared to today. And that is on the basis of an economy that's going to be twice as big in 2050 than it is today, with 2 billion extra people. And oil and gas demand reductions of 75 and 55% by 2050, respectively. So those assumptions are really quite different to what we're seeing today. So how do you square that circle based upon what we've just heard from each of you? How do we go from where we are today, where fossil fuels are very much at the center of energy and economy, to a world which looks really remarkably different in 2050? What's the answer to that? Who would like to answer that one? Ahmad, would you like to have a go at that one?
I saw Sam raise her hand. Did you want to speak, or do you want me to start?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on you. I was just going to comment just in terms of the IEA roadmap, since as I work for the IEA, I think the report that we released in May really was in response to the growing number of governments that are committing to net zero targets. So many of these are sort of in the 2050 timeframe. Some governments are aiming to achieve net zero a bit earlier, some a bit later. But currently around 70% of energy use and GDP is now covered by some form of net zero commitment. And really what we wanted to do with this report was provide some granularity really around what this would look like at a global scale. And indeed it is challenging. What we're talking about is a fundamental transformation in how we use, how we produce, how we transport energy in the next 3 decades. And I think we need to have a good understanding and have transparency around the challenges associated with this. just if I can just pick up the point about the sort of no new oil and gas, this wasn't sort of an assumption in the model. This was an outcome of the kind of fundamental changes that we would need to see on the demand side, where the demand for fossil fuels would fall to the extent that it wouldn't be necessary to deliver new or develop new oil and gas facilities, for example. So I think, we've got to ensure that we're looking at both the demand and the supply side when we're talking about the sort of transformation we need.
Thanks for that clarification, Samantha. So I'd like to move on now to, well, how do we move forward? So last year, the G20 endorsed something called the circular carbon economy. Ahmad, can you briefly explain what the circular carbon economy is and why would the G20 endorse such a thing?
So, the traditional economy has been basically a make, use, and discard economy. There's a traditional economy where we take resources, we use them, and then we throw away the waste. The circular economy concept is an old concept, relatively, last 30 years or so. And that is basically to reuse the waste and kind of capture the waste and reutilize it either in the form of reuse it as is or recycle it in some way. Applying this concept, and many thinkers have applied to CO2, is a new idea relatively the last 10 years or so. And that's basically to not just reuse and recycle, but also to remove and actually from the system. And that's the concept of the 4 R's, which is the components of the circular carbon economy. To reduce the use first, that's number one. That's the cheapest way of reducing emissions. Then to reuse them where you can, where there's some use of them in the economy. To recycle them if there's a use as well, and of course to remove permanently, either through nature-based solutions or through geological sequestration. So those are the kind of 4 R's that make up the circular economy. And it's really just a framework. It's a way for people to understand simply that we have to apply a holistic approach to this challenge and that we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Fossil fuels are serving us quite well. If we can deal with the emissions, which is the wastewater, we don't have to throw them out. We can actually continue to have a smooth transition and be able to bring in technologies which will allow a economic use and growth as the world needs.
So, Alex,
Adam, would you like to add?
Yeah, the G20 ministers actually used a bunch of interesting adjectives to describe the circular carbon economy. Voluntary, holistic, integrated, inclusive, pragmatic, and complementary. And I think what they were kind of getting at was that it was, as Ahmed said, a very useful framework for thinking about how to respond to the need to reduce emissions. And in coming back to the issue of pathways to net zero, carbon neutrality, lower emissions, I love the use of the plural in that, pathways. And let me come back to the G20. I think what the G20 recognized was that the circular carbon economy wasn't actually trying to say that there was a particular technology that was the best, that all of the options should be on the table, and that the markets ought to be making the choices at least as much as it gets done by policymakers. So you come back to the reduce function. Absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, most of the progress we've been made so far has been through efficiency and renewables. But we need to add hydrogen into that mix. We need more reuse and recycling of carbon dioxide. We need more removal. Things like direct air capture, nature-based solutions, whether it's oceans or coastal restorations, forestry, and so on. All of those things need to be employed and deployed. Deploy. Get it done, and get it done in quantities. Drive the cost down.
So returning now to the IEA report, the NetZero report, it seems to me, Sam, and you might want to correct me here if I'm wrong or pass a view, that the circular carbon economy, which essentially is a framework that values every emissions reduction and efficiency measure that is available, is consistent with the approach that the IEA and others have been promoting really for decades, which is we're going to need every single option, every technology, every strategy deployed in an optimal fashion in order to achieve emissions reduction at the lowest risk and the lowest cost, and importantly, the fastest possible rate. Have I described that fairly? Would you like to
For sure.
build on what I just said there?
I think definitely one of the advantages of the circular carbon economy approach is that it is a holistic approach, and it does underscore that we need a range of technologies and solutions. And of course, this is a message that we've heard from the IEA for many, many years, and is really fundamental, I think, to the NetZero report that we released this year. The scale of the challenge that we face in terms of meeting not just our climate objectives, but also these other energy security objectives, energy access, economic development, really means that we need the full suite of options that are available. So yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to remind everyone, the circular carbon economy has 4 elements: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And carbon capture, utilisation and storage is relevant to how many of those, Ahmad?
So in fact, it's relevant to almost all 3 of them because of the carbon capture element. In the reuse, you need to capture the CO2. Whether you're going to use it for example, enhanced oil recovery, or you're going to do it for we use it for fracking for example, in Aramco, there is a capture element that has to be applied. In the case of recycling, obviously you have to capture the CO2 to reuse it either in fuels or chemicals, or for example, in concrete. For example, that another technology we've been actually scaling up and working quite well on. And then finally, remove, of course, is based on carbon capture and sequestration, and that's the 3 R's. In fact, even reduce. We look at, for example, ways of production of blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is a way of reducing the carbon footprint of fossil fuels by removing the CO2 pre-combustion, and so that's a CO2 removal effort prior to the use of the fuel, which is also, again, so all the 4 R's actually have some element of CCUS involved in them.
And direct air capture, I guess, is one of the most recent classes of technologies that's burst onto the world stage. And when I first heard about direct air capture, I've got to say, probably about a decade ago, I thought it was crazy. I don't think it's crazy anymore. It definitely has a role. There's no doubt about that. It's amazing how quickly things can change in a relatively short period of time when it comes to technology. So CCUS clearly has an important role in the circular carbon economy, along with everything else. I mean, it's far from a silver bullet here. There are plenty of circumstances where CCUS makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But there are plenty of circumstances where it absolutely makes a lot of sense, and really needs to do its share of the heavy lifting in order to achieve emissions reductions. In the Institute, we've seen what we think is a very strong growth in momentum behind CCUS projects over the past, or particularly the last year, and going back probably the last 3 years. Sam, would you agree with that from your position in the International Energy Agency? How have you seen CCUS projects advance over recent years?
So I would absolutely agree with you, Alex, that I think the momentum and the level of activity that we're currently seeing around CCUS, and particularly project plans, is really unprecedented. And even just in 2021 alone, we're seeing on average at least 1 major project announcement a week. So there's been 40 or 50 projects announced already in 2021. And I think if we looked back 3, 4, 5 years ago, you'd be lucky to see, half a dozen projects being planned in any given year. So I think we've seen this very significant uptick in CCUS activity, and really that's being driven by, firstly, I think the net zero goals. There's this growing appreciation that meeting net zero ambitions really will require CCUS. And also we've seen an improved investment environment. So things like the 45Q tax credit in the United States, that's prompted a lot of interest and project activity. So I think, there's been very significant and positive developments around CCUS just in the past 2 or 3 years.
Absolutely agree. In fact, look out for the global status of CCS report in October. It'll put a number on how many new projects there are. Really very impressive. Sorry, Adam, we cut you off there.
No, I just wanted to agree with Sam and add that there have been a couple of very interesting papers written recently. One in the Journal of Energy Policy that looked at CCUS projects and concluded that some of the problems that occurred in the past were really a problem of the institutional factors and the technology not evolving well together, in a timing standpoint, and that we need government and private institutions working together to provide the right set of incentives to make sure that there is a proper market for the CO2 that the capture technologies can create. The 45Q that Sam mentioned is the tax code portion in the United States that provides a credit for every ton of CO2 that can be stored. Something similar is going to be put in place in Canada starting next year. I think other countries are looking at this as well. There are push and pull policies that can be put in place. Push policies include things like support for research and development and demonstration projects. Pull policies could include things like procurement. The government just simply offers to be a market, for example, for the output of different technologies, including carbon. So there are ways to do this, and I think we're doing better now than we were a decade ago, for sure. And I see that this is going to be really taking off, and it's important because some of the people, back to your first question, Alex, that are saying, well, let's just ban fossil fuels or hydrocarbons, I think are making the assumption that things like carbon capture are unproven, and they're not. They're proven. They are scalable. We just have to get the financial incentives right through a combination of the right institutional arrangements and continuing reduction in costs.
Can I add something here?
Of course, CCS. Of course, Ahmad.
Yeah, right. No, I just want to say that it's night and day. What the environment for CCUS over the last few years. And in 2017, I recall being on a panel, and actually on the Economist panel in the UK, in London, where I was asked on CCUS, and I gave my views of it. And I remember, what the headlines the next day around the world was, Aramco CTO says CCUS is cheap and easy. So that wasn't well received at the time. And because I think they left out the rest of my sentence, which was, I said, in the hard to decarbonize sectors, it was relatively your best option. And that's why it was probably the cheapest and easiest option. Unfortunately, at the time, people didn't recognize hard to decarbonize sectors. They didn't really understand and I think there's been a sea change. I think the IEA has helped a lot. I think the IPCC reports, which came out a little later, a couple of years after that, which showed that, in fact, there's no way to net zero without at least 90% of the scenarios require some form of negative emissions. And then finally, I think the ambition by many countries to achieve net zero has made them look at the economic realities and really do the same calculation that we have done in the past, which is that if you really want to get to net zero, you need to have negative emissions, or you've got to put in, at least for stationary carbon capture, and be able to reduce it at a lower cost. And that's where I think that economic reality didn't come in until people started calculating what it's going to take to get to net zero.
Sam, do you want to say something before I jump in? Because I've been cutting people off.
No, well, maybe if
Okay.
I could just add, I mean, I agree with what's been said, of course, but I think the fact that this is really a commercial challenge around CCUS rather than a technology challenge is bearing out, because we're seeing that where the incentives are in place, and again, the 45Q tax credit, but other programs, and even now a higher carbon price or line of sight to higher carbon pricing in Europe, this is providing the incentives for projects. It's not the technology that's holding it back. So I think this needs to be recognised in terms of how we design future support.
Absolutely true. It's a business case equation here. It's not a technology equation. The technology, actually, CCS turns 50 years old next year, since the first commercial CCS facility started operating in the US. So it's almost as old as I am. Okay, that was a really, really good discussion. I'd like to talk a little bit now about one other driver of this change. So there's been a lot of talk about policy changes and about the increasing recognition of the difficulty of getting to net zero, and therefore the need for CCUS alongside everything else to achieve that. What about ESG? So we in the Institute have been seeing market increase in engagement with finance sector, financiers, ESG community on CCS, who are all trying to learn about this technology called CCS. And I'd like to get your views on the extent to which you think ESG considerations are playing into this momentum that we're seeing in CCS investment over the past year or two.
Maybe I should start, anyway, since ESG has a big impact on the companies more than anything else. So I would say that the ESG impact has been, in general, positive for companies to be able to evaluate, their environmental impact. However, I think climate is such a long-term impact that it really doesn't fit into the typical ESG priorities. And let's put it that way. It's more of a business strategic decision than it is an ESG decision in the normal sense. And I think that by actually misplacing ESG investment, which is a kind of a short term, on a long term problem, we're creating really big problems for the market. I think that, for example, people are making decisions now to disinvest out of fossil fuels, and we all know that the fossil fuel development cycle, or the petroleum, oil and gas in general, is a long term cycle with long term investments. And it needs continuous investment because it's a declining resource, and therefore you need to continuously invest just to tread water, just to maintain the same energy output. And so applying these approaches has been, I think, negative for the market because it's created pressures on management to make decisions they wouldn't. They know better not to do, basically. Let me put it this way. So, and in fact, the worst is than ESG is courts getting involved in business strategy. We are already seeing courts ordering companies to reduce their development, and so I think it's a big mistake. I think we're going to see the results of that.
Alex, let me just add.
Adam, sorry, yes.
Yeah, okay. Let me add to Ahmad's points. The ESG, it's kind of thinking about environment, social and governance issues. And a lot of times we hear the term ESG investing. So it's about capital formation, and that's what Ahmad was talking about. Like how do you channel the investment opportunity set of industry towards the things that have the right environmental and social goals. And I'd like to come back to the idea of the circular carbon economy, which is holistic. It says all of the options should be on the table. And I'm kind of thinking that ESG investing ought to look a little bit like that itself. Right now, it seems that every ESG article that I read talks about renewables, but maybe efficiency investments ought to fall, into that kind of investing. And well, if green hydrogen is ESG friendly, well, why not blue hydrogen? Ultimately, blue hydrogen is just as beneficial to our our emissions management goals as green hydrogen is. And if we can think about it that way, then that would be a really useful thing. I'm concerned that the kinds of investments that we're going to need to actually meet the Paris Agreement goals are broader than the ESG community is currently thinking about. And they need to broaden out into this. Let's get more options on the table because the task in front of us is really big.
So the issue you're raising is one of recognition of the value of things like CCUS in an ESG framework. I think that's a very astute observation. But do you think ESG considerations have impacted the strategy of hydrocarbon producers, large oil and gas producers? We see, for example, the big oil and gas companies as really being leaders in the CCUS space of developing projects, of investing real money in projects. There's got to be a reason for that, right? At the moment, generally speaking, CCUS is not yet profitable. Policy environment is not quite there yet in most places. In some places it is, but in most places it's not. So is ESG in a longer term view driving that sort of pivot towards increasing investment in CCUS? Do you think?
Yeah, if I can say, yeah, I think definitely it is. I mean, they are ESG considerations. My only concern is when the companies themselves make those decisions. That's the right path. That's the right thing. They understand what's best, in interest of the company. And when we see almost investment or activist investment, who are not familiar with the economics of the energy supply system intervening, that's when we get these kind of real big problems, because you're seeing arbitrary disinvestment in energy supply, and it will create crises in the future. That's my biggest concern. We've been saying for years, if you look at the capital investment in the oil and gas industry, ESG concerns not from within the companies understand what it's going to take to do the transition. That's why they're investing in CCUS. They're investing in economic ways of bringing down emissions. If left to themselves and their ESG, their boards and their investors, without the pressure, outside pressure, which is driving them, basically demonizing their product and forcing them to make the wrong economic decisions, in my view, by reducing capital investment. We're seeing capital investment going down over the years, and it is even in the best IEA scenario, we expect oil demand to continue to rise. Now, these two things don't work together, for the next at least 10 years, and so we don't. Something has to give, and it is giving. Supply has to meet that demand. I know that we've had extra supply for the last few years, but that cushion is disappearing.
Sam, you must have something to say here.
Sure do. No, I think really there is a mix of the pressure from the ESG community and also internal sort of corporate strategies that are driving these transformations that we're seeing, particularly in the oil and gas sector and the majors. But I just want to highlight a report that the IEA released early last year, which looked at the role of the oil and gas sector in energy transitions, but did highlight that actually relatively limited capital expenditure is going into non-core areas. So only about 1% of the capital expenditure of oil majors is going into non-core technologies, for example, such as CCUS. So we're seeing a shift, but it's still relatively small in terms of the overall expenditure profile of the oil and gas companies. Having said that, certainly in the CCUS space, oil and gas involvement and leadership is critical. It has been to date in terms of the projects that are have been deployed and are operating. Many of the projects that are being planned have very strong oil and gas sector involvement, and of course the sector has the subsurface skills and expertise that's needed to develop CO2 storage. It has the experience with major infrastructure projects, including offshore, and it has a balance sheet that can support some of these investments. So there's a really important role, I think, for the sector in driving particularly the deployment of CCUS technologies.
Okay, so I'd like to move on now and talk about hydrogen. So clean hydrogen has emerged as a very important pathway towards net zero. And there appears now to be a competition between green and blue, which I think is great, because wherever there's competition, you get efficiencies and cost reductions and things get cheaper. And that's exactly what we need for both blue and green. But how do you see that playing out? How do you see the blue, which is from fossil fuels with CCS, versus green, which is hydrogen produced from using electrolyzers and renewable power? How do you see that playing out going forwards?
Well, let me.
Go ahead, Adam. I've been talking too much.
All right, I'll get a really short one. I like them both. I think we need. I've said this before, and I just keep repeating it because I think it's really important for everybody to know. We have to keep all of these options on the table. I think it's too early to choose. And we do know that right now the blue pathway is probably less expensive than green, but that might not be true forever. There is a big, huge $5 billion green hydrogen project underway in Saudi Arabia. Ahmed could talk about what Saudi Aramco has been doing with Japan on demonstrating blue hydrogen and ammonia. But I think it's got to be all hands on deck. Get these demonstration projects going so that we get the experience of doing it, learning by doing and driving the cost down, almost exactly really the way we did with solar panels and wind turbines. We just need to do it with more technologies. Ahmed.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly, completely. Right now, blue is possible at scale because, basically adding incremental capital to decarbonize existing hydrogen production is a fast way of at scale producing blue hydrogen, which we've already demonstrated we can do. We've done, we did a quick, it was really easy because the equipment was all there. The facilities were all there. We just captured the CO2, which was already being captured for you anyway in the ammonia process. And sequestered that without any additional capital investment. So it demonstrates that blue hydrogen can be brought to the market fast at scale. Now, I really don't even like the color terms personally because there's an infinite variation between blue and green. We're working on technologies today that utilize electricity to reform methane. And so when you use renewable electricity to reform methane, what is that? Is that blue or green, or is it in between? So I'm not sure the economics are going to drive us to intermediate solutions. I don't think we're going to have a pure blue or a pure green or a pink or whatever, because they're going to come, the economics drive you. The point is, what is the emissions? And I think, that's what's important. What we need to understand is that we need to understand the full life cycle emissions associated with the fuel products we produce, whether they're hydrocarbons, by the way, or synthetic hydrocarbons, hydrogen, ammonia. It's critical that we understand the full life cycle, and that's that holistic approach. You take a look at the full life cycle of your product. But otherwise, you may have, negative consequences. You might have you can actually, people aren't aware, but in fact, green hydrogen has a finite carbon footprint. A lot of people assume automatically it's zero. It does have a finite carbon footprint. The manufacturing of the solar panels and the wind mills actually do have a carbon footprint from day one. And the larger the capital, the greater the capital expenditure, the greater you actually have to dig out of a hole to pay back your carbon footprint. So there's complexity in this, and the best approach to me is certification, validation, standards. We need to put in place these standards that define what does low carbon mean, and it has to be practical. We have to start practical. We can We can bring the targets lower over time, but we really need to start practically in order to make this an industry that will actually economically deliver. It has to have incentives to be able to deliver. And I think we've shown with renewables that by giving them incentives, we're able to scale it up and produce, really lower the cost. We can do that with blue hydrogen. We can do that with green hydrogen. I'm confident, in fact, that we will be doing a lot of green hydrogen out of this region at least, and I think globally over time.
Sam, what's the IEA's view on different forms of clean hydrogen? I'm going to avoid the colours.
So we don't colour our hydrogen at the IEA. So, I would say, Alex, I agree with you that competition is great. I think what's not particularly helpful is having this either-or discussion, whether it's hydrogen or, the broader suite of technologies. I think the reality is hydrogen can be, such an important part of energy transitions, and we're going to need both sort of CCUS equipped routes as well as electrolytic based routes. And as Ahmad said, we can use CCUS equipped routes that can be cost effectively scaled up sort of faster in the near term. Maybe if I can just use an example from our IEA NetZero Roadmap. So by 2050, the split between the CCUS equipped production routes and electrolytic is 40-60. And so, both are playing a role, but the electrolytic pathway already requires us to scale up electrolyzer capacity at a very rapid rate. So we would be installing what is currently the world's largest electrolyzer every 36 hours between now and 2050 already. But if we want to take the CCUS equipped pathways or the blue hydrogen out of the equation, the power needs and the electricity needs for that would be equivalent to all of global electricity demand today. And this is, electricity that you have to build out just to service hydrogen demand. So, this underscores...
And it has to be zero emissions electricity as well.
Clean, of course.
It has to be zero emissions electricity.
Yeah, so I think we need to be pragmatic and understand the challenge and the need for this portfolio of approaches, including within the hydrogen sphere.
Yeah. So in some places, blue hydrogen will be the most sensible choice, and in other places, green hydrogen will be the most sensible choice. And it comes down to what resources are available in those locations, as well as economics. And sorry, Adam, I cut you off again.
No, I wanted to follow up on Sam's great comment about avoiding either-or choices. The history of energy is that we don't actually get rid of fuels when we keep consuming more, and so the point is, when hydrogen comes in, it might not be replacing something else. It might be the next wave of fuel and a cleaner one, a lower carbon version of something that's had too much carbon in the past, and ultimately we end up having a set of fuels that still might involve hydrocarbons, but at a much lower rate of and even negative emissions associated with the CO2 going into the air, right? So what we want to do is clean things up, and it's probably not going to happen by stopping the use of oil or gas, for example. We just have to find a way to use the oil and gas in a way that's environmentally friendly.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to give each of you 30 seconds, no more than 30 seconds, just to mention what you think are the most exciting technologies, markets, or products that you can see emerging over the next decade or so, which are relevant to achieving net zero going forwards. Ahmad, would you like to go first?
I think obviously renewables, there's no question that the renewable costs are incredible and going down fast. And storage now is extremely exciting. We've made a number of investments in some really exciting storage, which we believe will actually make renewables available 24 hours a day one day. So this is something we're really excited about. Hydrogen, no question. We're big believers in hydrogen. We intend to be some of the biggest suppliers of low carbon hydrogen going forward. I want to end on synthetic fuels. I really believe that aviation will not be decarbonized without synthetic liquid hydrocarbon fuels, which we are working on as well. We have a number of projects. So those are the three topics that come to mind.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ahmad. Adam?
I put my vote in for direct air capture. We're going to need better matrices that pull the carbon out of the air. And we're going to have to do that at scale. We're seeing a lot of work happening in that area. And I think that could be really, really exciting. We actually get rid of the emissions problem, put it somewhere where it's more useful, either tucked away safely or being recycled or reused. And that's going to help us out a lot.
Thank you, Adam. And the last word from Samantha McCulloch.
So Adam stole mine. I was also going to say direct air capture, picking a technology in the CCUS space. But I think what's really exciting here is, Alex, you mentioned earlier, a decade ago, this sounded, a bit far-fetched in some ways. But now we're seeing a lot of interest and progress being made with these technologies. Now plans to build a 1 million-ton facility in the United States. And I think the interest that now goes beyond the traditional energy sector. So we're seeing investment from, airlines, from major IT companies, the Googles and Microsofts of the world, and recognizing the important role that these technologies can play in terms of carbon removal, but also in the future as a sort of carbon neutral source of CO2 for things like synthetic fuels for aviation. So I think this is a really, exciting and interesting area that's moving quite fast at the moment. So I think it's one to keep an eye on.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those comments. That brings us to the end of our session. Thanks so much to our panelists, Ahmad Al Khowaiter, Samantha McCulloch and Adam Sieminski, for your time, your wisdom and your insights. I encourage all of those who are watching this to join the next session, which will commence shortly. Thank you and goodbye.